Hello to our listeners. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about career paths into journalism. Do you need to go to journalism school? What are the different ways to get into this field? And is journalism school always the answer? So, we're going to be talking to two early career journalists who have basically had very impressive and impactful journalism work done in recent times and who come from two very different parts of the world.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this because I didn't go to journalism school. So super curious to hear what the experience looks like.
You're an impact producer here at Lighthouse. How did you get here?
Yeah, so I didn't study journalism and I didn't also start my career as a journalist. I started in political campaigning and then I kind of transferred over to journalism, through this kind of impact producer pathway, which is, more using the skills from, political campaigning, such as like strategy and audience thinking to apply that to journalism. But Beatriz, you did not go to journalism school either, right?
So, I studied for my undergrad, like politics and international relations.
Oh my God, same. The Vegas degree.
So true. And then I went on to this master's that was basically the title was Media Communications and Development. And it was really theoretical and it was more about how the media or the press gets wrong, like coverage of the global majority world. So it was like very like political, philosophical debates. And the classes that I took at the time were more tailored to working in like the NGO charity space, which is where I thought I was going to end up. I remember this course had like one journalism class and I didn't take it. I took a film class instead, which was really fun. But so I didn't like get either like this traditional journalism education. But I think this is like also a good place to mention that several people at Lighthouse actually don't have traditional career paths. One of my personal favorites is the career path of one of our colleagues, a senior reporter here who's Crofton Black. So he studied medieval philosophy. He has a PhD in that. And then he used to work as a rare book cataloger.
No way, I had no idea.
He basically, from that, just started doing work like as research for an NGO. Then he started working like investigating the CIA's secret detention program. And that's basically was how he got into journalism. So yeah, you never know what life has in store. There's literally like no one way to get it right.
Wow, that's a super interesting background. And also kind of what a like dramatic step aside from the CIA. I wonder what that was like. So we should mention here actually that this is part one of a two-part series. And, this episode will be talking a bit about people's experiences in getting into journalism. And then part two, we will speak to the professors and the trainers from their perspective about, what's going on at journalism school at the moment. If you're entering the career as a journalist or if you're an emerging journalist, what kind of training opportunities or programs should you be looking for? So stay tuned for that one. That will be the next month.
Yeah, and I think we will just preface by saying I said this a little bit before, but this is also personal. There's no recipe on what you should and shouldn't do, but we thought it would be really cool, basically just show the career path of these two journalists that we're going to introduce and have a wider discussion about how and whether journalism schools are these key places to advance, in the field. So we will be speaking to Laís Martins.
So my name is Laís Martins. I'm a Brazilian investigative journalist. I'm currently working for the Intercept Brazil, and I cover mostly tech, human rights, and politics. And I'm also a Pulitzer Center AI Accountability Fellow.
She has a more traditional journalism training background. She is a really accomplished journalist, and her most recent body of work, which was really massive and really impactful, was that she led this investigative series on the impact of a TikTok data center in an indigenous territory in Ceará, Brazil. And we're going to link her profile so you can have a look at her work later. And then the other person that we will be interviewing is Shoeb Abdullah.
So my name is Shoeb. I'm an audiovisual archivist and journalist, though I would prefer to call myself open source investigator. So I'm based in Bangladesh and I'm currently working with an organization called Activate Rights. So Activate Rights is a digital rights organization based in Dhaka.
He, on the other hand, took on this really non-traditional path. His work is more around visual archiving of human rights violations, and he works a lot on open source investigations. So, taking this all into consideration, what we're going to be talking about here today is quite context specific to where these two journalists are working, but hope you enjoy the episode. From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real-world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, Impact Editor Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva. And before we jump in, if you're enjoying Backlight, can you please leave us a rating, send the episode to a friend, or leave us a comment telling us what you want to cover next? So, first off, we asked Laís, did you go to journalism school?
Yes, I did twice, actually. So I did journalism school for my bachelor's, but then I also went back and did it for my master's. I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, so I think journalism school was always in the picture for me. But there was an interesting discussion around the time I was still in university or like about to go in about whether like it should be required of journalists to have a diploma as a professional activity or not. And it was a really controversial discussion at the time in Brazil. And I've changed my mind so many times about this since, I graduated and since I started school. Going back to what made me decide, it was never really a possibility in my mind being a journalist and not undergoing journalistic training. And then the decision to do the master's was because I thought bachelor's in journalism here in Brazil was a bit outdated, I have to say. And then when I went and worked, so I started working, and also in Brazil, we do internships when we're still doing the bachelor's. So I felt that, the field was actually really more challenging than what university painted it to be. And this was at the time of Bolsonaro's election, and that really made me want to go back and study a bit more the theory. So I went and did my master's in journalism and political communication.
Yeah, super interesting. And we'll get into Laís's master's degree a little bit later in the episode, but I wanted to pick up on something that she said around the kind of controversy that she was referring to in Brazil about whether journalists should be required to have a diploma in order to kind of enter the professional activity. And I think it's something that we're seeing reflected today with so many content creators online who don't necessarily have a formal journalism background or training, but they are acting as journalists, and they are who increasingly a lot of younger people are going to.
Yeah, and a lot of people go to journalism school, obviously, to get a foot in the door. Laís told us she actually got her first internship through being at school because it's sort of part of a curriculum. And while she says she really enjoyed the experience, she did recognize that a lot of what she got taught was quite outdated.
I had a teacher, I'll never forget him. He used to grade, we used to deliver articles for his class, and he used to grade them in red pencil, and he would just slaughter a draft. It was all red everywhere. So in Brazil, we have a manual, literally a journalistic manual that is from one of the biggest newspapers, legacy newspapers here. And he would grade them side by side, so the paper and the manual. And that was from the 90s. I think it was so outdated in the sense that, yes, grammar and all these, how do you name specific cities? Yeah, that's important. But then I think the backbone of it was a journalistic tradition that was in the past already. But for example, things around sources, no, we didn't really discuss that. We had cases where, again, Watergate, we discussed what was the role of the source and how they worked with an anonymous source in that case. But these were things I honestly only learned in practice when I started working. How do you actually do it? Because I also think there's a thing here, which is in J school, we discuss very big cases, right? The big scoops. And let's be honest, in our careers, most of the time we're doing boring work. We're not working on massive scoops, right? That happens once in a lifetime. I've been lucky to have it happen with me, but it's very rare that you see that play out in practice.
So this is so true. I didn't do, like I said, traditional journalism school, but there are so many things which you just end up learning on the go.
We discuss ethics. I think that's the most valuable This is why I defend journalistic training or like going to J school, because of this whole ethics discussion. It doesn't mean university has got it right. I think the discussion is a bit outdated in the sense that we're still like sticking too much to the idea of objectivity and neutrality. But I think having this space for this type of discussion is really the value of university.
Yeah, it's interesting the gap she's pointing out here between what you learn at school and what you actually need to apply to the real world. And I think that's kind of a general discontent with a lot of university degrees, is they feel very separated from what's actually happening in the workforce in the real world. And maybe they're acting more as this kind of foot in the door, as you were saying earlier, rather than an actual place of training and learning.
Yeah, and I think for Laís, it's safe to say that her career ended up being a mix of opportunities created by the jobs that she was able to land. So she actually decided to do her master's because of an experience she had taking up a job at Reuters. She started working there around the time which was leading up to Bolsonaro's election.
I applied for an internship with Reuters and I started working there because I wanted to work in international journalism. So Reuters was like the dream come true. In general, what I felt from that election that made me want to go back and study was that even the more experienced journalists were caught by surprise. For example, how do you react when Bolsonaro looks at you and says, you look a bit gay? Because he did that to some of the journalists, right? Or do we call him out for his lies? I saw that inside the newsroom, these were ongoing discussions between editors. So I thought, okay, it's been very exciting working with campaign. You're outside, you're on the street for like days at a time, sometimes, 8-hour days. It was very thrilling, literally in the sense, but it did have a cost. I hurt my back really bad during that election and I was like 21. So that's not normal. But I thought, you know what? I could see myself doing this in the long run, but I feel like I need more. I don't understand what is happening. I didn't like the feeling that we were only reacting to the news and we weren't able to step away and have a look at the bigger picture. It felt like we were always chasing, So I thought, maybe I want to study more.
Yeah, so Laís went on to do this master's degree called the Erasmus Mundus Journalism Program, which is a 2-year course. The first year based in Aarhus in Denmark, and then the second year you can choose your location, and she chose the University of Amsterdam. And she specialized in political communications, which is actually kind of funny because I think a year or two later, I ended up doing the same course, but not exactly the same, but I did political communication science. So we had some modules with the Erasmus Mundus Journalism Program students. So I guess I kind of studied journalism in a way. And what I think was really interesting that she told us was, it's a super international program, but one of the main reasons, as I guess why she was attracted to it, is because she got this really great scholarship that covered her living and her university costs. And, I think that kind of also points to a wider structural issue with universities or journalism schools, is that they are very expensive and they're only getting more and more expensive. And this kind of only allows, a very elite set of people to be able to access that university, or, people who are very, very committed and are happy to kind of put that loan to their name.
At the time, it was an interesting moment because, Bolsonaro in Brazil, but also, we were seeing the rise of populists in Europe. So the discussion was very political and politicized. And I really appreciated the capacity of being able to discuss journalistic practice within academia and this idea that journalism is political. This is something I don't feel we always have space for when we're working, because we're meant to depolitize our work in many places. So I thought that was the most interesting bit. There's a funny anecdote from when I was applying for the master's that I went up to a very high profile person at the newsroom I was working at. And this person told me, yeah, sure, I can write you a letter of recommendation, but you know that you'll never get from the master's what you're getting here, right? Inside the industry, I think there's this idea that, maybe you have to go through basic journalism school when you're an undergrad, but academia will never give you the same quality or the same teachings as working.
This is a great seg into the debate of work experience versus journalism school. Of course, this can go hand in hand depending on the opportunities you have access to, namely because journalism school isn't always affordable. And there's definitely something to be said about how much you just learn on the go.
So my first job was it's a website in Brazil called IG. So this is before Instagram, right? IG, that's the name. And it was a very well-known outlet in Brazil back around the 2000s because it kind of launched this idea of news on the internet. So that's kind of where I learned to work with hard news, daily news. She would send me out to cover protests. I will never forget one of my first interviews on the phone. I was sitting beside her and I told her, oh yeah, I'm going to call this person. And I got up and I went out and she was like, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to call outside. And she's like, call here. Are you embarrassed of speaking on the phone? And I was like, kind of. And she's like, no, first lesson, you can never be embarrassed. And now every time I think of, I have to call someone like controversial to get a statement or something, I remember her telling me like, you cannot be embarrassed. That's the basis of our profession. Calling people, like that's so normal. So now I tell this to like my young journalists who are around me, like, don't be embarrassed of calling. Like that's journalism 101, right? There's a lot that I feel I learned just from seeing others do, like older professionals. So going into a newsroom and, feeling the dynamics of the newsroom, like watching people pick up the phone and call, and you see how they speak with the source on the phone, whether it's a government source or like someone from the industry. There's so much in this type of imitation game that is valuable. And I really feel bad for the generations of today that are not going into newsrooms, that are no longer having the opportunity to experience journalism side by side with people who are older.
So one of the things I enjoyed hearing from her in this conversation was how she feels about the changes that should be happening in journalism curriculums, and how these should basically be changed so that they resonate more with the world that we're living in today.
If you were to ask me, what would you put in a curriculum nowadays for journalism? I would change it up completely. I think it's not useful at the moment. It doesn't reflect what the industry is like, specifically the opportunities that we have. And it's missing very big, important discussions like the journalist activist thing. And we've discussed this, right, Beatriz, in person. Like, it's something that only, I guess, after 10 years of working in journalism, that became an internal discussion for myself, in the sense that, am I bending the norms of objectivity? Am I going too far? What is too far? Who has the capacity to tell me that this is too far? This is a discussion that should be happening right now in journalism schools. And I know for a fact, because my cousin is going through journalism school at the moment, it's not happening.
Just some final thoughts from Laís before we go and chat to Shoeb. So we asked her, what she makes of her career today and how important she really thinks that journalism school was for her in this context.
It wasn't really journalism school, but it was more like me in journalism school, because I look at some from my class, even from my group of friends, I would say less than 5 are working in journalism today. What happened to me in university was I was really curious. I've always been very don't ask, don't get. I think many opportunities that came up, I would just sign up. I'm just going for it because I wanted to learn. And I feel that I had the privilege, and in Brazil, this is truly a privilege, of not having to work the first few years of my bachelor's. My only duty there was to be a student. Yeah, I went into like workshops. I would do free online courses. I would stay after hours at J school, like watching extra classes. And I think I really took advantage of everything J school had to offer. And the fact that I was in a university also meant I could watch classes from other courses. So sometimes I would watch law classes, like just out of curiosity. Psychology also, because it was the same campus.
Yeah, I really agree with what she was saying there about how journalism school, or I think, university in general, gives you time to develop your own way of thinking. And I think the privilege of going to university in general is having that dedicated space to be able to think about what you want to do in the future, but also to kind of develop your critical thinking skills that are really, really crucial in the workplace. And, I think it's her attitude and also her hard work that kind of speaks maybe to her, success in her career now, more so than the fact that it was just the fact she went to journalism school and had this kind of formal training. Because she even goes on to say, that I thought was interesting, that only 1 in 5 of her colleagues are working in journalism. And, maybe that's speaks to a little bit about the industry itself and, how does kind of feel like there's not as many opportunities as before to kind of get your foot in the door. But also that maybe journalism school in general teaches you quite applicable skills that you can then go on to use in other places.
Totally. And we have to include her final piece of advice, which is, if you do make it there to journalism school, please don't rely on AI.
I've interacted with journalistic or journalism students in the past few months or year, and I know that they're using AI all over their work, and it depresses me so much. I'm like, what is journalism going to look like in the future? Literally, I was invited by a friend to be interviewed by a group of students, and I could, just from the questions, see what were the questions that AI wrote and who actually had time and went through my work to ask good questions.
Yeah, this is so funny to me because I think ChatGPT arrived in the very end of my master's degree. And I was so thankful that it was actually really shit back then, because I was forced throughout my degree to still use my brain and actually had to concentrate. And, I think if that temptation was there today, it would be so easy to kind of just, ask it to do analytical thinking for you, because why not? It's there. So we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. Next, we're going to be chatting to Shoeb, who is a journalist and digital rights activist in Bangladesh. You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can always reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com. Welcome back to Backlight. On this month's episode, we're talking about journalism school. Is it still needed in order to get into the field? We just heard from Laís about her experience going to 2 different journalism schools. And now we're going to talk to Shoeb about his experience approaching journalism from a different point of view.
Unfortunately, I didn't went any journalism school. So I was actually graduated from University of Dhaka, the political science department. From the very beginning, I started my work as a the magazine, as a feature reporter. That was kind of my first job. And then from that, I was trying to kind of participating some investigation on some matters, and then turned my career into the fact checkers. From that, I was actually working with the open source investigation for the very beginning. It wasn't a very informed decision to starting this work in this field, but staying and continuing work in this field, that was a very informed decision. So I was trying to be a kind of a journalist for last at least 6 years, actually.
So Shoeb told us that in Bangladesh, journalism school is a really big thing. It's often labeled as a mass communications course. And he described to us that growing up, he was really inspired by Bangladeshi journalists who had succeeded in the field without taking up any formal training.
Growing up, I was fascinated by amazing journalists working this here who never went to any journalism school. Some graduated from physics, some graduated from statistics, some lot of this kind of a different fields. And it was always a kind of a peer learning process. So I saw that a lot of these young journalists who never went journalism school, but they ended up as a very passionate investigative reporter in this field, because they got amazing peers with some experienced editor. So in my thought, it is always important to get some kind of outside school where the training rather than just went to journalism. But I have a very great respect to the journalism school here.
Yeah, so his experience actually came from his first job as a fact checker. And then he kind of built on that and began to network and meet people that got him to the place where he is today.
My career started as a fact checker. So it was a very early stage of fact checking, 2017-18. So that time the fact checking was a big thing. So everyone is trying to kind of acquire this skill. So I started working with a Facebook third-party fact-checking program. That time it was called Facebook 3FCP. And then now it's a Meta third-party fact-checking program. So my job was mostly to debunk the misinformation and clean this platform. That was kind of my initial job that time. But when I tried to kind of like understand this field in the broader different continents, we saw that really interesting organization emerged in this field. They're using the open source skills to exposing war crime, exposing kind of like a big corruption. So, for example, the Bellingcat, it's one of the great organizations that time. Like we are really fascinated by them, and of course, like OCCRP did a lot of this investigation on the using digital skill. So we are kind of like thinking about to go beyond just debunking job. So it was me and my colleague, we started different investigation using open source technique and trying to kind of like do something is not just limited to debunking some information integrity things, you know? So that was kind of like our first started in this field. And then I was trying to kind of like participate with different investigation process with different investigation media outlets. So I was kind of like working with them as a like voluntary basis. Sometimes kind of like an intern to understand that skill and knowledges. That's kind of like a first thing. And then over the time, we are get familiar with kind of like different non-profit organization, non-profit media outlets, and also the organization who are working on media development. For example, GIGN, Global Investigative Journalism Network, what's like amazing organization. They produce a lot of the interesting open source materials. So, and also they have organized a lot of this webinar and sort of these things. We are regularly participating them. And also the one of the organization I can mention that is like Foyo Media Institute. It was based in I think Sweden. So they organize a lot of the in-person training programs. So we are trying to kind of like are participating them. That's kind of like how we learn. But over the time, it was a kind of like a peer learning process. When someone has actually started the work, and then we are trying to kind of like touch with them, trying to kind of like help them. It's kind of like a collaboratively piece together in the investigation. That's how we are started. But now I think this lot of these international organizations are also working in this field. For example, the last 2 years, the Witness investigation team was one of the organizations that was really invested in Bangladesh on specifically train young human rights defenders and young journalists to use open source investigation to expose the human rights abuses. And of course, like Deutsche Welle Academy, they have an amazing program in here. Every year, they train a lot of these young journalists.
And there's so many great free training courses out there, and he mentioned some great ones.
Yeah, definitely. I think specifically if you're looking to do open source investigations or learn those digital skills, there's so many different training programs. And actually, I think our OSINT colleague Bashar is a self-taught OSINT reporter as well. And so I think that's just to say that so many of these skills are also adapting and developing. And, sometimes the best thing you can do is do a program that, really teaches you the most up-to-date methods.
Now we are working with Witness. So our organization is working on the video technology and of course its investigation. So you also train a lot of these young people in Bangladesh who are now working as a digital investigator to using open source material to turn into the investigation, to exposing human rights violation and other stuff. Over the time, I'm actually lead the Bangladesh Protest Archive. It's called BPA. So we do a lot of this collaboration with the investigative media outlets, where we train a lot of these young people. Also, the organization Witness that we are collaborating with. So they have also the program. We train the young journalists, human rights defenders to use the open source knowledge to expose human rights violation.
Yeah, Witness is really great. And they are teaching people to record or document human rights abuses in their own countries. And it's this idea that anyone can be a documenter and play a really, really essential role in journalism, especially in contexts where traditional journalism is quite oppressed by the state and can often be quite limited. Shoeb's career has me thinking about the kinds of skills that you need as a journalist and how there's so many different ways to obtain those skills. So, we talked a little bit about how many people teach themselves open source reporters. But, many people, for example, just pick up a camera and start recording in their room and become a creator. And, they figure out these things like editorial standards and fact-checking along the way. It gives me a bit of pause and makes me curious about, the direction of the field and to think, is this a threat to journalism, or is this something that, enables more people to take the positions of journalism and then therefore makes journalism more accessible to everyone?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think if all our backlight episodes were like the curriculum of a school program, what I would say, learning after like speaking to so many people month after month, is yeah, it can't be a threat. We have to find a way to work together. I think that that's what we've been learning, right? There's so many people taking on, becoming self-taught, or like maybe not being a journalist in the conventional sense of it, but they are reaching audiences in important ways. So optimistically, hopefully not a threat if people follow ethical standards.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is a good point of reflection for journalism institutions and also journalism outlets in general, is to think, well, we are kind of abiding by one way of practicing journalism, but maybe, that might be a way that works, this kind of, adherence to objectivity, this kind of very rigorous set of ethical and fact-checking standards, that might be a way that works in some contexts, but it might not work in all.
And it's interesting because Shoeb describes how he has learned from all these different organizations the skills to become an OSINT reporter today. And now he's actually involved in the training. Like, it's this full circle process where he now is teaching other aspiring journalists. And I think that's also a great thing about this field, which is, like we kept saying throughout this episode, there is no set way to become a journalist. You could self-train, you could become a freelancer first. You can start out by reporting stories on your own. So yeah, no right or wrong. And I think also something that we should flag and acknowledge, it's the state of journalism and the journalism industry, which is, if at the moment you're listening to this and you're struggling to break into the industry, you're not alone. We are in a situation, obviously, where there's mass layoffs happening more and more often, so many risks and threats to journalism and journalists, and less entry-level jobs, I think, just kind of being aware through my friends and colleagues. So I think Shoeb's experience is really interesting in how he tried to circumvent some of that.
In 2025 and 2026, we actually trained 2 cohort of journalists and human rights activists. It was kind of like the online series of online program. And of course, we have conducted the in-person workshop as well. So in last January, we conducted 3-day-long open source investigation training for human rights defenders and young journalists. And after that, we had actually the interesting impact that from that community, some young journalists actually published several pieces of investigation to, of course, like using a lot of these open source techniques that we shared during this workshop.
Yeah, one of the big questions about journalism school is a question of access. Programs are incredibly expensive. And also then on top of that, there's things like visa costs and housing costs that really make it only accessible to an elite few. And the programs that Shoeb is running and that he took himself are kind of filling this gap where access isn't possible. And so to finish up, we asked Shoeb about his thoughts on journalism school in general.
Every year, a lot of the young students actually entered the different journalism schools in Bangladesh. But the problem is not everyone wanted to be a journalist. Rather than they are choosing this subject as a kind of like an academic accomplishment. The another problem is we just have the academic institution who teaching journalism. We don't have any independent center who has invested on journalism in these areas. A lot of these young journalists in Bangladesh still, they are struggling to understand core of journalism, because they teaches actually journalism as a part of the academic program, and there is no way to experiment, and there is no way to kind of like practicing their skills. And also the another problem is like a lot of the good journalism school is still a very city centered. So if you wanted to kind of like learn journalism, you have to actually enter like those very specific school. We have almost every public university, they have journalism schools, but that journalism school is not practicing wise, it's not very good. Another challenge is globally, the investment on journalism, it's not very good. In Bangladesh, in global south country, we don't have a lot of this investor or independent journalism, and specifically the investigative journalism process.
Yeah, and a similar point here is this issue that he raises. Journalism schools can be quite city-centered. That's really important. And, it makes it less of an accessible option for everybody.
Yeah, and I guess my next natural follow-up thought is, I wonder and I hope that, journalism outlets that are hiring emerging and young journalists take training programs as seriously as they do a journalism school and aren't just kind of looking for that big name school that people have on their CV, but are actually taking into consideration the skills that people have and also the efforts that they've gone to get those skills as well.
A lot of these young journalists came in this space and they're doing amazing work. For example, like just last 2 months ago, one of our alumni actually got the international prize to exposing one of the human rights violation in Bangladesh during 2024. My advice would be sometimes people who are entered this journalism school, they're very kind of like confined themselves with the same idea of the journalism that like taught by that school. But it needs to be kind of like a more explorative. For example, in Bangladesh, a lot of these young journalists and a lot of this journalism school is not add the open source investigation skill, fact checking, and different kind of like a new skill in their curriculum process. It's still not. It's still a very kind of like a theoretical focus, only the academic version of journalism that they're teaching to the students. And sometimes like when after the graduation, young people are really struggling. And also, I wanted to kind of like advise the young journalists who are struggling to more connect with like the non-profit journalism outlet, different investigative outlets. For example, the Lighthouse Report is one of the great places that we are always referring to the young journalists to go and check this different process. For example, in the last, we had a small working group of the young journalists and human rights defender. We sit together every month. So just last week, we presented actually one of the investigation that Lighthouse reports and evidence did in Sudan human rights crime. You can also learn a process of investigative journalism by reading another journalism's work. That's how actually the great process. And you can also replicate it. A lot of this, our investigation process, we actually replicated from the different media outlets.
Yeah, and that's a great note to end on. It's been really interesting to hear from Laís and Shoeb, who are in different parts of the world, and getting to hear the differences and overlaps in their experiences getting into journalism. And so clearly, every country has their own journalistic tradition and views journalism school really differently. And we just got some insights here from Brazil and from Bangladesh. But if you'd like to share with us what's the situation like in your country, or if you have any questions on this topic that you'd like us to address in part 2, please send us an email. Our email is backlight@lighthousereports.com. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, and hope you enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm looking forward to part 2, where we talk to the trainers and the professors of journalism programs to understand kind of what's happening in the industry and how journalism schools are adapting to context changes. But that's all for this month. Thank you so much for listening. To keep updated with our investigations, you can follow us on our social media. Our Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Blue Sky handles are @Lighthouse Reports, or you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. And all of those will be linked in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating or send this episode to a friend. It really helps. This episode was produced and hosted by Tessa and Beatriz Silva. It was sound edited and designed by Elli Xypolitaki at Spoovio. Thanks everyone, and see you next month.